Okay. Our next speaker is going to be Jakob Willisch, who is the head of product data at the Platinum PyData sponsor Babel, which is the world's top grossing language app. And so usually when tech companies want to test causal assumptions, they do A/B testing. However, Jakob is trying to convince us in his talk that you can do causal inference on data even if you haven't conducted experiment. And with that, please take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. So I'm going to talk to you about quasi-experimental methods in causal inference and their practical pitfalls. Before I get going to that, I wanted to get a little bit more of a feel for why you are here. So who in the room is actually in the business of informing human decisions with using data? That's actually quite a lot. Who here is in the business of informing machine decisions using data? All right, and who is here because they were intrigued by the title of the talk but don't really know what this is about? All right, a couple of those as well. So what you will get out of this talk depends on how you answer that question. If you're in the business of informing human decisions, what I hope you get out of this is a little bit of a broader view over the toolkits that you have available in the Python open data stack. I will also give you a little bit of a process, a workflow that you can go through to avoid common pitfalls. And I also walk you through a case in the domain of language learning, the domain that Babel is operating in. If you're in the business of informing machine decision making, then I'm hoping that you get out of this a couple of tools of how you can actually identify a couple of, or your common confounders that might be actually unobservable instead of observable. And if you answer the positive to that last question, I'm hoping to give you a little primer to this domain to spark your interest. All right, so let's start with some basic concepts. We've heard this before, why people like experiments and A/B testing. Well, we like it because it gives us the core assumptions that we need to solve the fundamental problem of causal inference by design for free. That's why we like it. So any kind of confounder that we have that could essentially or confuse or confound the causal effects between a treatment A and B towards an outcome Y, that is taken care of by design just because of the magic of randomness. What a quasi-experiment is, and how I'm going to be using it in the course of the talk, is what we're looking for is, instead of actually using actively randomness to assign a treatment, we're looking for a statement or for some assumptions that we can make based on properties of the data generating process that allows us to make a statement like as if random. So we're looking at a sample or a treatment that is as if randomly assigned. That's the core point of using quasi-experiments for causal inference. But that poses a problem. And that problem is related to this kind of overview that every data scientist or analyst has probably seen or used themselves when talking to their stakeholders, their decision makers, for why they should invest in certain methods to inform decision making. It's essentially showing the trade-off between the quality of evidence that you're basing your decision on and the cost of evidence that you have to take on in order to get that information. At the top of the pyramid, it's usually kind of called the meta-analysis of randomized control trials, followed by actual A/B test randomized control trials. Then there comes this box of quasi-experimental designs, then variable N studies, observational studies, expert opinion, and my personal favorite, intuition, or the highest paid person in the room opinion. Now, when we are zooming into that quasi-experimental design box, things get a little bit more messy. It is not, especially for newcomers into this domain, it's not entirely clear what you're actually buying into when you're using a lot of the methods that are employed in the quasi-experimental design. So we've heard, I think, a talk before about difference in difference approaches, staggered difference in difference. We've heard a lot about causal ML, so using type of various instrumental variable approaches or propensity score matching. But what you're buying into is considerably difficult for you as an analyst or a data scientist to actually tell your decision maker, hey, these are the results that we're seeing, but hey, these are the type of assumptions that you're buying into. And that is a core problem when you buy into kind of the basic tenet of my talk, which is good decisions require knowledge or information, but knowledge is bought with assumptions. And if you treat your assumptions as a currency, it is your job as a data professional to actually assign a value to that. Like, what am I actually buying into? So what I want to give you along at this first, in this first part of my talk is this relatively straightforward process or workflow that you can go through in order to avoid some common pitfalls and make it easy for you to visualize and make your assumptions explicit to the decision maker that you're informing. First up is start with a causal model. A lot of times, these types of methods are geared to looking at them and saying, oh, I know that I have this type of problem or this type of decision that I could inform with this, but start with the problem and your causal model first. That will make it so much more easier to shape your selection of methods, to make your assumptions explicit to whoever decision you are actually informing, and it's generally going to structure your thoughts about the problem that you're looking at. Second, estimate. When you're looking at actually then estimate, after you have your causal model, you've identified what you actually want to estimate and what assumptions you're making that make this estimate actually a causal relationship. Consider multiple methods to test your observational assumptions, implications. Usually, we're using one particular method, and in the case that I'm going to show you in the second part of the talk, I'm also focusing on one specific method. But generally, there are multiple ways that lead to Rome, and I can encourage everyone to look into multiple methods when you're testing your observational implications from your causal model. And last up, refute your assumptions. And this is probably one of the biggest things to take care of. These types of methods, these types of processes and problems really geared to the sunk cost fallacy. You run all through this workflow, you see kind of nice effect sizes, they're all statistically significant, and then you clap your hands, say, oh, great, I've identified and shown a causal effect, and walk away. But the crucial part is to actually actively refute your own assumptions, because those are the currency that your decision maker is actually buying into when taking a decision. The good news about this is that generally the open source stack and the Python open source stack in particular can help you do that. And this is a highly subjective user perspective. I'm not actually involved in any of these projects. But what I wanted to give you a little bit of a rundown of some notable mentions. So I think one of the very positive development is this open source project from Microsoft called DoY. Their EconML package falls under that family. What they have set out to do is really give you an end-to-end process or end-to-end tool to do causal inference using various methods. So they will really guide you through your causal graphs. They are steering you to input a causal graph. They're identifying the estimates. They have implemented methods to actually do the estimation, and then implemented methods to test your assumptions. Another two notable mentions that I'm also going to use in the second part of my talk are one tool that is actually coming more of the R community, which is Dagety, which gives you an easy way, kind of online tool to actually build your causal models using directed acyclical graphs. And not only that, it's also giving you some pointers to which type of assumptions you're actually making in order to properly identify an estimate. Another notable mention that I was very positively impressed by was a package or a project coming out of the PyMC community, which is CausalPy, which also implements a couple of methods that are very, very prominent in the social science, particularly economics domain, not so much in the data science, data analytics industry domain, and I think this package is also doing a very good job at guiding through making these methods more usable. All right, but enough about the abstract. Let's get down to an actual case from the domain of language learning that I want to walk you through in order to showcase this process and also cover one particular method, which is regression discontinuity design. The case that we're looking into is along the following question. Are language learners actually motivated to learn more intensely if we show them a higher proficiency assessment? Why do we care about this? So instead of walking you through why my stakeholders, the decision makers at Bubble, care about this, think about, or take a second to think about your favorite teacher in school. All right, I hope everyone has some person in mind. Now think about the most effective teacher in school. All right, for me personally, when I think about those, these are actually two different people. And the crucial part that we're continuously thinking and have to take decisions on at Bubble is, are we going to be the lenient teacher that is erring on the easy side in order to motivate our learners to stick with language learning? Or are we going to be the little bit more rigorous, more strict teacher that is actually showing them, okay, here is something that you have to learn, here's something that you have to brush up. And that is oftentimes a trade-off, and a lot of times dialecticians and decision makers that we work with have a bit of a leniency to more of the easy side under the assumption that that actually incentivizes and motivates learners to continue to learn. Now, let's look at the data generating process that we're exploiting here. So what I'm going to look at is a feature at Bubble which is called the Bubble English test. It's a multi-stage dynamically evaluated language proficiency test in multiple stages. Now all the ML folks look at this and say, ooh, neural network. It's not a neural network. It's just a dynamically evaluated test where at every stage we're asking multiple questions and evaluating the user's proficiency at each node, which with one very, very important property of this process, which is the last node. And at the last node, there is a fixed threshold that decides whether a learner whose proficiency we have evaluated up to the last node will keep whether we will display to them the CFR level that they've just been evaluated with, or whether they're getting bumped up by one CFR level. And that is the property that we're going to exploit in this case for identifying a causal effect. A couple of descriptors, so about the sample that we're looking at here, it's about 31,000 test takers in the course of the last year. The average time spent learning within 7 days of the test, which is going to be kind of the operationalization of learning motivation that we're going to use, or in a observable implication of that, is about 1.2 hours. The average score on that final node that we're going to exploit is about 66%. So the majority of learners are actually below that 80% threshold. All right, so how does that work? How can we think about that? How can we exploit that property in order to answer the question, does the display of a CFR level, higher or lower, actually causally affect the motivation and the learning intensity of our learners? So, first step, think about your causal model. And I can recommend to you to use directed acyclical graphs. We've heard the primer by Judea Pearl, which I can hardly recommend on the topic. But here's my simple recommendation for why to use directed acyclical graphs instead of other frameworks that you can use, because it's reusable. You can reuse the graph that you have to model your causal process in to actually explain then to your decision maker for what they're buying into. But back to the case. So what we're exploiting here, or the general problem that we have, is we want to estimate the effect between showing a different CFR level and learning intensity with let's say, an assumption that there's some kind of motivation mediator in the middle. Now we can run a regression and just look at, okay, how does a CFR level display actually correlate with learning intensity, but that is not really well causally identified because we have that hidden thing in the middle, which is the actual proficiency, the actual knowledge of the learner, which we cannot directly observe. In fact, that's actually the point for why we're doing the test, right? We want to have a proxy measure for what the proficiency of the learner is, but this is a confounder because proficiency will very likely both affect the learning intensity that users are showing after taking the test, as well as their actual CFR assessment. So that's a confounder, and even more problematic, it's an unobservable confounder. What we can do in order to exploit that fact that there is this, non-continuous jump at this node is we can treat our assignment variable, which is the success rate in the last node, as essentially deciding whether the user gets treatment or not. Right? So if the user is above that 80% threshold, they will get treated. They're going to get bumped up by a CFR level. If they're not treated, they're going to remain in their CFR level. So this is a stylized graph. This is not actually showing the data that I referred to before. Now, the crucial identification assumption that we're making is as we are going closer and subsampling just around that threshold, we're going to end up with users that are roughly similar, that are as if randomly distributed. Why? Because our test takers cannot very precisely steer whether they're going to be above or below that 80% threshold. That's the crucial identification assumptions that we're making here. All right, so step 2 in the process, estimate. When we're looking at this, and I'm skipping over a couple of different things that I recommend you do other than just running one single model and then saying, great. What we're doing here is we're essentially fitting 2 local regressions around a bandwidth around that 80% threshold from both sides. You can get a lot more fancy on, depending on how your distributions look like, depending on certain assumptions that you make about the data generating process. You can look into fitting nonlinear models. You can use splines. There's a lot of different things that you can do in order to make a more robust estimation here. But what we find for this particular case, if we take a 10% bandwidth around the 80% threshold, and fit local regressions on both sides of that bandwidth, we end up with a roughly a negative 39 minutes or learning minutes effect in the 7 days after our learners took the test. So this model is estimated using CausalPy. I can hardly recommend looking into that. It's a relatively early stage project, but I find it very, very usable and easy to understand. All right, so at that point, you may find yourself or your decision maker asking, okay, Jacob, so what? Well, that negative effect of showing the higher CFR level, to me at least, is quite surprising. So one takeaway for decision makers may be, well, if you continue to think about these kind of decisions that you make to develop your product, erring on the side of more easy content, more digestible content, that assumption that you may have that is actually motivating is not necessarily true. And that is a relatively easy kind of, or quick to implement method to show that with some more rigor than just using at correlations and patterns. But there are a couple of bigger caveats that we have to think about when telling that to our decision maker. Because you still have sample selection, potentially, into who's actually taking the test, right? Depending on how you expose that to your users, you might actually only get the users to take the test who are already at a high proficiency. You might have all kinds of different selection problems that are even at an earlier stage than the selection within the test takers. Another bigger point, and we've heard a couple of very good talks on this topic, is heterogeneous treatment effects. So one thing that you need to take care of, and I'm not going to get into in the interest of time here, is that effect that we see, that negative 39 minutes, might actually be different across different CFR, across different levels of language learners, right? So one hypothesis is that for the lower level language learners, that effect might actually be positive, So they're the motivational effect of actually showing them, hey, you are actually progressing higher. That might be there, whereas for the more mature, more the advanced language learners, that effect might actually then turn negative. Why is that important? Well, because that directly informs a decision by the team that is maybe iterating on this assessment feature. All right, just in terms of quick things to do to refute a couple of assumptions that we made in this analysis is the two big ones for regression discontinuity design are usually self-selection across the cutoff. So when your learners or when your subjects can actually have very precise control of self-selecting across that 80% threshold, then one of your core identification assumptions goes out of the window. Because then the as-if random statement across those 80%, that 80% threshold is not true anymore. One way of how to do that is to look at densities across your assignment variable, your running variable. So if your subjects are actually self-selecting, you would see some bunching around the cutoff. Right? You wouldn't see kind of a smooth distribution, you would see some bunching on the cutoff, which we don't see in this case. But we do see something else, which is that the running variable actually seems to follow not necessarily a completely continuous trajectory, which has to do with the number of questions that we ask at each node. So that is something to look into, whether that actually breaks a couple of assumptions of regression discontinuity design. The other thing that you can do is to do covariate or inspect your covariate balances. If your as-if random assumption is true around the cutoff, then any kind of other attributes about your subjects should be roughly balanced across the left and the right side of the cutoff within that 10% bandwidth, right? So if you see that there's a humongous imbalance that is not statistically significant, that's a pointer that something is going on that actually tanks the assumptions that you're making. In this case, I've just plotted put some of those in a table here. We don't see any major imbalances across the left side and the right side of the cutoff. All right, coming to key takeaways. My first recommendation when you are focusing on causal inference in general, but more specifically on using quasi-experimental methods, so looking for that as-if random element in your data generating process, is work backwards. Don't fall into the trap of looking at this talk and now saying, oh, and now I'm looking for regression discontinuity design applications. Think about your causal problem first, and then go forward to identify the proper methods that you can use in order to answer it. That's one big takeaway. Second, do put a lot of time into actually thinking and plotting your causal model, because that will help you and give you a reusable asset to actually make your assumption explicit. And third, please do your best to refute your assumptions, because it's very easy for these methods to do the classical stargazing and then walk away. You really do have to make an effort to disprove your own assumptions here. And last, and that's more kind of a call to explore those packages, there's a really, really thriving open source project landscape in Python coming up. I come from an R world where this is a lot more mature, I would say, and I'm really happy to see that this is a growing community. And lastly, if you're interested in the stuff that I talked about, or you're looking for an opportunity, we are still hiring at Bubble, especially in the data domain. Currently, we're looking for data manager and warehouse engineers, but we're always interested in also initial applications. And I'm going to leave that QR code up for the round of questions that I'm opening up for.